and I didn't know that I would be able to add anything new. But then as I did some initial research, I found that there was so much I didn't know about the events that took place here, and talking to other people that, in fact, very few people knew what happened during those final days. And I thought it was such an important story and such an important part of our history that I was very interested in telling that story. And then when I uncovered some of the personal stories and these stories of the heroes who had sacrificed so much and been really willing to sacrifice their own lives to save the Vietnamese, then I was hooked. And then, you know, I really wanted to tell this story. So.
Where did you get some of the footage from?
So the question is, where did I get some of the footage from? So we did, you know, a lot of the traditional archival houses, the ABC, NBC, CBS, and they were a great source, and we tried to dig deeper into those. When I was developing this film, I had another film, which I think a number of you were at the screening here a couple years ago of Ethel, that was coming out, and I was showing it at theaters and screening places throughout the East Coast, and I was inviting people who I identified as wanting to interview for this film to those screenings, to meet them and introduce myself and whatnot. Anyway, so in the DC screening, there was a fellow there who had been on the USS Kirk, and I was telling him about what we were planning on doing and what our intention was, and he came back to me about 15 minutes later, and he said, you know, you talked about the Kirk and the story, and it's so important. He said, you know, I was talking to my buddy a few months ago, and he said he was just up in his attic and came across all of this Super 8 footage that it was undeveloped, and it was of the USS Kirk. Would you be interested in that? I said yes, I'd be very interested in that. And so I got the guy's phone number, and I called him at 9 o'clock the next morning, and I said, you know, I'd love to get this footage, and can I FedEx it? And he wouldn't let. He was very protective of it, and he wouldn't let me FedEx it to us. But so I flew him out to California on a plane with a box in his hand, and he brought it out, and we developed it. And 12 minutes of our footage is, you know, all the story of the Chinook, the helicopters going overboard, the flag raising, lowering at the end of the film, those images of you know, the overcrowded ships, that was all his footage. So that was, you know, that was a huge source and great fun.
Question?
Moving
Ambassador
on.
Martin, was this the end of his career, and how's he been treated in history?
Well, he died of cancer a few years after this. So yeah, this was basically the end of his career, and you know, I think that he's treated well. I feel like we really tried to capture him in this. That he was, you know, he was mixed. He was mixed.
Way up there.
We represented Frank Snepp after this was over, and his heroism in trying to get as many people out as possible really ruined and ended his career with the CIA. Is that the general lesson here, that people who took risks and disobeyed orders? I saw that Armitage had, you know, he had a good career after that. What decided whether the heroes here were treated badly or well by our government after?
Well, it's a good question, and I think it's a complicated answer, and I think it really depends on the individual and those circumstances, because there were many people who did illegal things who were then considered and treated as heroes after the war, and then there were, you know, others who were fully marginalized and whose career was ended as a result. And Frank Snepp, you know, he then wrote a book, as you know, about the events that took place, and you know, he had some challenges and difficulties as a result of that. So I think it really depended on exactly what you did, what you revealed, what the conditions were, and you know, what your position was, and how well you were able to kind of navigate that world.
The woman right here.
What are you working on now?
Well, I have two films that I'm producing, part of a series called Makers, which is a PBS series about women, and so I'm doing an hour on women in politics and women in Hollywood, which I'm finishing. And then this film I'm really committed to, and it's coming out in theaters in the fall, where it's going to about 15 theaters. It's continuing to show in film festivals before it's broadcast on PBS in April. So I'm going out with it.
Surprised that you called it looting and they did it because they were so angry. I mean, it would have just fallen into the hands
desks and the tables and the file cabinets. Isn't it good that they took it?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't my term, looting, obviously, but that was the newscaster. And I think that, it was, I agree that it was a complicated time, but I think that the film is sympathetic to that moment and ultimately is kind of understanding of why they're doing that. Even though there's, that word is used, I think ultimately you kind of emotionally feel for the people who are doing it and, aren't judgmental in those terms exactly.
David?
Yeah, the 130,000 that were evacuated, where did they end up? They went to the Philippines. What was the journey from
Well,
there?
almost all of them ended up in the United States. And part of what we're doing with our outreach efforts around the film is trying to gather some of those stories and putting them online of the Vietnamese who came here, who came to this country, what happened to them. Because it's an extraordinary story and a hugely successful story of a culture and a group of people who came to this country and were integrated very quickly and have been a hugely important part of our nation and contributed in enormous ways. So we're excited to share that story beyond the film on PBS online.
Yeah, Rory, do you want to say something about the outreach that you're going to be doing and how anyone in the audience might contribute or be a part of that?
That's so nice. Well, we are engaging in an outreach campaign, and the hope is to try to extend the reach and the impact of the film to as many audiences as possible. One of the great things and kind of surprising experiences for me is sharing this film with Vietnamese, because I would say, not to generalize, but largely speaking, it's a culture where they haven't really talked about what happened during these final days, and this has opened up a dialogue in that community that's been really significant and very humbling to witness for me. And so we're really excited to reach out to that community, to engage them, to include their stories, and to reach out to general audiences. We're going into schools, educational programs, and facilities to try to really reach as large a number of people as possible. And we're doing that through PBS, and we're doing an Indiegogo campaign, which just started yesterday, and we've raised $24,000, so that's exciting. I would love for your involvement. So.
Yes, this gentleman.
It's a very good film and very engaging, and a very engaging story. What do you think is, if there is one, what is the point, editorial point, if you will, that you're trying to make in the film? Is it that we didn't do what we should have done? Is it that Graham Martin was a bit of a, I don't know, a nut,
Right.
if you want to call it that? But
I think, I didn't have a particular agenda in making this film, and I'm, very happy that we didn't do any interviews with experts. There's nobody looking back. It's all people on the front lines talking about what had happened. And I think that's important to tell this story, to simply tell the story and to have it documented, because a lot of people don't know what happened in those last days. I think that it's very hard at this juncture to watch this film and not think about what's going on in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I think, my hope is that audiences might draw a connection and see what's going on there. And what I would say is, going back to the question up at the top there, is that it's very hard once you get to this point, when you're in the last days, to have any good decisions made, because there are no good decisions to be made, really. And so what you have to do is think about, when you get into a war, when you get into Iraq, when you get into Afghanistan, when you're thinking about getting into Syria and other places, what's your exit strategy? How are we going to get out of this? What's that going to look like? What are our responsibilities? So, that to me is the obvious sort of connection to what's happening.